Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Zhou reporting in Beijing. With a UN tribunal ruling on the South China Sea approaching, exchange of rhetoric between the world's two biggest economic powers has been heating up. Washington claims it will continue to carry out operations in the disputed waters. Beijing, on the other hand, says the U.S. patrols warrant defensive measures. So, what is the responsible course of action in the South China Sea? Is a code of conduct needed for activities in the region? And do Washington and Beijing have the capacity and the will to work out their differences? To talk about these and more, I'm happy to be joined in the studio by Clifford Kirikoff, an educator from the Virginia Military Institute, who is also a former senior staff professional of the United States Senate Foreign Relations Committee. But before we begin our discussions, let's take a look at this.
Staying neutral. The US has long maintained that it is neutral when it comes to territorial disputes. China is one claimant, while Vietnam, the Philippines, Malaysia, Brunei are among the other claimants. The US Secretary of State reiterated this stance in January.
Let me emphasize again, the United States does not take sides on the sovereignty questions underlying the territorial disputes. We ask that all parties clarify their claims under international law, that they exercise restraint, and that they adhere to peaceful and diplomatic ways of addressing disagreements.
But as part of Washington's pivot to Asia, the US has reinvigorated a security alliance and is helping it modernize its navy. It's also rotating more ships to Singapore and Marines to Australia, as well as inking new defense guidelines with its ally Japan, which could see joint patrols in the South China Sea. Manila's current arbitration case was drawn up and is being argued by US attorneys Paul Reichler and Bernard Oxman, along with two professors from the UK. In December 2014, the US State Department issued a 26-page memorandum concluding that unless China revised its claim, it's not in accordance with the law of the sea. Senior American officials have claimed that the US will strive to uphold the rule of law in the South China Sea. And this April, the US also urged ASEAN unity on the ruling. So how is China responding?
The Philippines stubbornly initiated and forced forward South China Sea arbitration case, and such action is unlawful, unfaithful and unreasonable. It is interesting that the US cannot stop talking about the arbitration case and UNCLOS. If the US really wants to uphold order and stability in the South China Sea, why hasn't it joined the UNCLOS yet?
The US is accusing China of militarization in the South China Sea, while it has repeatedly sent military vessels and aircraft on surveillance missions, which China sees as acts of provocation. Beijing hopes Washington will honor its commitment of not taking sides on the South China Sea issue. The arbitration case could perhaps be a good place for the US to start.
Welcome to Dialogue. We're talking about South China Sea issue. Well, the Chinese Foreign Ministry Clifford is saying the South China Sea has become one of the biggest obstacles between China and the U.S. Why it has become a major obstacle in the major power relations between China and the U.S.? What has been covered?
Well, I think we have to look back a few years to the so-called pivot policy of the Obama administration. So the South China Sea situation today is a result of that rebalancing of U.S. forces, so-called, and the Obama pivot policy. So look at it in a bit of a larger context. And the pivot policy itself reflects a larger global strategic concept of the Obama administration. Mm-hmm. You could say even the encirclement of the Eurasian Peninsula, the Eurasian landmass.
And this is why the U.S. has been increasing its military presence in this part of the world, and why China is so antagonistic about this.
Yes, the U.S. administration, the Obama administration had said early on in the pivot that the military component of the pivot would see a shift of about 60% or whatever of our various forces into the Pacific region. So the military component of the pivot policy is definitely a shift of military forces to the Pacific.
Do you see any historical parallels to this kind of disputes? How can maritime and island territory sovereignty disputes be solved in the past? Anything we can learn?
Well, yes, you know, We could take the example of the North Sea in Europe, where the European powers were able to, through diplomacy and negotiation, patiently, resolve issues regarding how do you demarcate and how do you arrange
through negotiations.
Yes, through negotiations to make arrangements about the North Sea, and of course that was oil related. And I think that's a very good, perhaps, model for the current crisis, the current situation, just the negotiations model.
And another thing is to shelve the differences, like what China and Japan has been doing for many decades.
That's true. If you're going to try to encourage a diplomatic process, diplomatic dialogue and negotiations, you have to reduce tensions. It's a little hard to have negotiations with a successful outcome if tensions are so escalated that people won't speak to each other. So a reduction of tensions is needed, and then a longer perspective of the time it would take to negotiate these matters carefully so that everyone is satisfied on a
But there is
win-win
another
basis.
way to solve this kind of disputes is through war, like what the British and the Argentinians have been doing in the 1980s.
Well, you know, I was down in Argentina during the Falklands War on official business. Yes, that was over some penguins and all that, but it's actually oil resources. And they could have diplomatically resolved through the United Nations or other means over a period of time. But unfortunately, one side did choose to use force against the other side, and then that started to escalate. So you're right, these things can escalate.
And which direction do you think this dispute is heading in the South China Sea?
Well, I know there are a lot of concerned specialists here in China and also in the United States that are worried that some accident or some incident or something along those lines could lead to some form of maybe military confrontation. So the thought is, let's try to tamp it down some.
So one way to tamp it down is China has raised one suggestion is dual track. One way we resolve our disputes through negotiations. The other way is that we maintain peace and stability by joining hands with ASEAN countries. Why isn't that working, and why it hasn't been accepted by all the concerned parties?
Well, I think it's a very sound and logical proposal to try to resolve these outstanding issues through negotiations and diplomacy. Patiently, it may take a considerable amount of time, but nonetheless resolving them with patience over a period of time I think is essential. On the other hand, the United States has, since 2010, started to push a little bit aggressively in the region, and sort of breathlessly trying to accelerate a negotiation process or even torpedo a negotiation process. So there's this outside or external actor that's come in for a variety of reasons, and I think it's complicated the regional situation.
But the U.S. will probably continue its posturing and maneuvering of its vessels and aircrafts in this part of the world.
Well, we've been out here a couple of centuries in the Pacific region, so it's not as if we're going away anytime soon. But it's how we're going to behave while we're over here.
How we're going to use the military.
Exactly. And so I think if, just speaking about the current situation, if Ms. Clinton would be elected, you'd have a continuation of this Obama policy, the pivot policy that she initiated. That could lead to negative consequences. Possibly Trump would be changing some of that confrontation policy.
But recently we have seen the U.S. has been always maintaining this is a maritime navigation freedom issue. But the China's counter argument is that there has never been freedom of navigation incident happening over the past decade. On the other hand, the U.S. has been trying to fly reconnaissance planes and vessels to gather information and intelligence very close to Chinese waters and Chinese territories. What do you make of the arguments and the counter-arguments?
Well, traditionally the United States for a couple of centuries has been for open seas as opposed to closed seas, which is a legal term. So freedom of the seas has a ring for Americans, but in this case I think it's misplaced. If you take a look at the shipping, most of the shipping is actually closer to China. The shipping lanes are quite a bit west of these island controversies. Also, you can sail through the Lombok and the Sunda Strait and kind of go around. So in terms of the navigation issue, just geography alone calls into question this sort of excuse of freedom of navigation operations.
So you think it is an excuse? There isn't a navigation freedom problem
there's
at all.
an interest, as I said, always in the philosophy of freedom of navigation. But in this case, I think we have somewhat of a pretext, not only geopolitical pretext, but also, the Navy's looking for higher budgets, and just like the Army is looking for higher budgets with the Ukraine crisis. So these tensions that are maybe not so necessary are also excuses for looking for more budget, defense budget, or for the weapons contractors to sell more hardware to each of the respective.
But do you think the two militaries will maintain cool-headed all over this process? Because just several days ago, there was an interception by Chinese fighter jets to American reconnaissance planes. That kind of thing happened about 20 years ago, and it was a major incident that really brought down the relations between the two.
Yes, that's why I think we need to calm things down, tamp it down, and reduce some of this unnecessary even provocations. At the same time, we need to strengthen military-to-military communication at all levels. At the level of the top level, the Joint Chiefs of our staff and your Chief of Staff, at the Defense Ministry level, and even at our Pacific Fleet and its counterpart here.
But you believe they have clear rules of engagement when the two militaries, vessels and aircrafts met?
I'm not so sure about that. I think we need to strengthen through bilateral discussion and agreement rules of engagement to take care of potential incidents. Many years ago, we had an incidents at sea agreement with the old Soviet Union, which, if something would happen, there was a mechanism to kind of tamp it down and avoid any escalation. So we need things like that out here.
But with the South China Sea issue so important with both, do you think we should establish a more closer cooperation mechanism for our two countries in maritime issues?
Oh, certainly. Not only at the mill level, but also for other forms of cooperation, peaceful cooperation and development of the seas. South China Sea could be a zone for development, peaceful development. It doesn't have to be a zone of conflict.
And another thing is the Chinese has been saying we need to have a code of conduct governing all the parties in this part of the world in terms of their activities and explorations. Do you think that's feasible? What is in the way of reaching an agreement of this kind?
Well, that could tie back into what I said earlier about the model of the North Sea, where the various countries agreed on managing the development of resources in the North Sea and in a peaceful manner. So the code of conduct also could include mechanisms to tamp down any untoward incidents.
But is it possible to reach any kind of agreement about code of conduct before they have agreement on sovereignty issues? Because those islands are still sovereignty
Yes,
disputes.
it is logical that this process is a long-term process. It's not going to happen overnight. So a long-term process of dialogue and negotiation obviously needs to be in place. The problem that we face at the moment, I think, is the United States is so impatient and thinking kind of in short term and pressing its so-called allies and engaging in provocative patrols and provocative intelligence. I mean, we don't need to engage in these intelligence gathering missions that often.
Why the United States is impatient about making moves? What is its intention? What is bothering the United States?
I think it again goes back to the pivot idea, this grandiose idea that we're going to pivot into the Pacific region and strengthen.
Because to counter the balance of the growing
Exactly.
China.
You bet that's exactly. It's a geopolitical, geostrategic concept to rally various countries here, the smaller countries here, and Japan, and rally those countries against China. That's the pivot. That is the purpose of the pivot.
So this dispute is just part of a larger geopolitical game.
Exactly.
That
It's
is
part
being
of a
played out
global
between two
geopolitical
powers.
game. Exactly.
But who do you think is winning in this game? Or
Well,
who is gaining more
unfortunately,
advantages?
I'd like to see the game stopped.
But obviously it is not.
That's true, and it won't be stopped until we get a new administration in Washington that has a different perspective. That is to say, has a multipolar world perspective. And if you have a multipolar world perspective, then you negotiate and make arrangements with the other major powers, and you resolve differences at the major power level, and you manage regions like this area, or you manage the Middle East situation. But it's going to take, that won't happen with the remaining months of the Obama administration, and it most certainly isn't going to happen in the Clinton administration, because she helped create the present policy. So the only hope that we might have is if Mr. Trump, as flamboyant a personality as he is, makes a clear break with the current policy, which he has said he would do.
All right, we're talking about the South China Sea issue with Mr. Clifford Karakov. You're watching Dialogue. We'll be back in a short while. Don't go away. You're now watching Dialogue. We're talking about the South China Sea issue here with Mr. Clifford Karakov. The U.S. is not directly involved in the issues, the South China Sea disputes, but as you said, as part of the pivot program, the U.S. has been always pulling the strings behind all the parties. But it seems some of the parties are more on board than the others. For example, the Philippines. Do you think with the new administration sworn in the Philippines that might change?
Well, it seems to me it's a good opportunity for the new administration in the Philippines to engage in a new dialogue with China and explore ways of resolving differences. So to me, there's an element of hopefulness with the new incoming leadership of the Philippines.
But it seems it is the Filipinos' interest to pit one against the other. An alliance with the U.S. it seems to be in the interests of the Philippines.
Well, the Philippines are neighbors out this way. We're far away. And it seems to me you should get along with your neighbors in your neighborhood.
Because obviously President-elect has been saying if we reach out to the Chinese and they will give us more opportunities to building railways and infrastructures, then probably we'll consider tone down our tones. What do you think he meant by that?
Well, I think the economic dimension of the relations, to me, should overcome the win-win possibilities, should overcome this sort of cat and mouse game, and perhaps the Philippines could discount some of the prodding from the administration in Washington or interference with the administration by the administration in Washington.
And what will happen to the arbitration case that the Philippines has brought to the Hague?
Well, you know, the
arbitration tribunal.
The arbitration requires to agree to the arbitration.
But China said we will not be part of this.
I'm not a fancy international lawyer, but the basics are that two parties would mutually agree to arbitration, and that would be within the international legal process. But in this case, one party has gone forward, the other party has not agreed to that. So there's no mutuality involved in seeking a judgment.
But actually, the Filipinos saw that happening before it brought up the case to the Hague Tribunal. It seems that their initial purpose is to get China on a court of morality.
Well, it seems to me that I don't know the quality of the legal profession in the Philippines, But I assume there are at least a few professors of law, international law, at some universities in the Philippines that would have some inkling about the correct procedures. So I assume this is more of a political move that possibly even some of the scholars, legal scholars in the Philippines might object to. As a matter of fact, while we're on the subject, some of the Philippine claims to some of the islands, they're claiming islands that when we were the colonial power in the Philippines, never even included on our own maps. So, you know, I think the Philippines scholars and legal scholars need to do a little bit more research.
And will the new president have a second thought about consolidating the military alliance with the U.S.?
Well, as I said, we've been out here for a couple centuries, and we try to be friends with everyone. I would think that, well, on the alliance structure, we have a lot of these Cold War alliances out this way, the so-called hub and spokes thing, the alliance with Japan and all of this. But that's all left over from the Cold War era. And I think we need to have that superseded by great power understandings, the U.S. and China and Japan and Russia, and have some discussions at that level, the major power level, and create a new Pacific community, a new security architecture. Just maintaining and strengthening these old Cold War structures, I think, is dangerous, actually.
But in the eyes of many Americans, China and Russia are still the potential opponents geopolitically. That's why it has been harboring the Cold War mentality all the time.
I would caveat that. I would say in the eyes of the dominant foreign policy elite, Russia and China are quote-unquote enemies. But I think in terms of the American people, just like people anywhere in the world, they would prefer peace, non-intervention, no war. I mean, we're sick and tired of it. We've been at war for 15 years out there in the Middle East. So the American public is actually fed up with war, fed up with confrontation, and does seek some peace. That's not the case with the elite, the foreign policy elites, which of course now the political revolution in the United States with Mr. Sanders and Mr. Trump, it's a revolution against that kind of elite imperial thinking.
But on the other hand, it seems that that's what America has been doing. It's trying to drawing out conflicted areas and asking more partners and alliances to do the job for it.
Yeah, it's trying to strengthen these Cold War structures. U.S.-Japan alliance, we used to have SEATO, as the Southeast Asian Treaty Organization back in the Cold War days, so this is kind of almost a rework of SEATO. ANZUS is still in place, Australia, New Zealand, U.S., that's still in place and being strengthened. So again, I would just say that the U.S. policy currently, under the current administration, is to beef up, globalize NATO. So it's beefing up these old, obsolete, antiquated alliance structures.
Another thing is what the U.S. has been calling the artificial island building in the South China Sea. Well, China has been building facilities in 7 of its controlled islands in the Nansha Islands, what we call, you call Spratly Islands. Do you think it is kind of a countermeasure to the U.S. Increasing military presence and increasing military alliance in South China Sea?
Well, I think it's you know, personally I think it's rather embarrassing. It's kind of a reversion to the 19th century gunboat diplomacy of the British Empire or something. And so our Secretary of Defense was educated at Oxford, and you know, he probably has these you know, imperial dreams, thinking back to the 19th century British naval empire. Whatever it is, whatever motivation it is on the part of the elite in Washington, it's wrong. And I think it causes a lot of trouble out this way.
But do you think China has the legitimate rights to build facilities on these islands?
Well, it seems to me it's not just China doing it. I mean, I think Vietnam is
and Vietnam and the Philippines has been doing it all along.
Yeah, so I think you just have to look at the whole thing. I'm a historian and a political scientist. You want to look at it in context, in a historical context. It's not just China. Although in the United States, the U.S. media, et cetera, or the politicians never point out that Vietnam and Philippines and other people are doing the same thing on the islands. So it's always focused against China.
But the U.S. Defense Department just released some maps showing that Vietnam has been doing this and on a very considerable large scale. It seems that U.S. tried to be neutral on this, but still has been blaming, most of the blame has been on China because the scale and the speed of the China's construction.
Yes, well, again, I think we just have to take it in the entire context, that several countries, not just China, are engaged in this sort of activity. Whether or not it's technically legal or not, the lawyers can debate and discuss, forever. But this activity is, in real terms, going on.
Another thing is the resources. There are a huge amount of resources, fishing resources, oil and gas resources. Many say this is why the reasons that those countries is being trying to compete for this resources. What do you think should be done between those countries in this part of the world?
Well, I think it's clearly the reason. Yeah, you're right. I think it's clearly the reason, particularly the oil side. And I'm glad you brought up the fisheries issue. It's some issue that has not been brought up. And as the population on Earth increases, protein source from the sea is going to be very vital to mankind. And cooperation on fisheries is going to be vital in the future. And also we're concerned about environmental issues, coral reefs, and the health of the seas. So here's an area, the environmental area, which is neutral, that all the countries could cooperate on peacefully, no problem. Why not have more marine sciences programs between the United States and China and the other countries in the region? So the fisheries management and the seas management could definitely be a peaceful endeavor. On the oil side, I would come back to the North Sea model, where the countries in Europe that were impacted by the geography and topography and the seas and all this and the depths and how you draw the lines and all, they negotiated it out.
Are you optimistic or pessimistic about the prospects of those countries sharing resources, resolving their disputes, and in what time frame?
Well, first of all, I think it's a fairly long time frame. I would be more optimistic if we have a regime change in Washington, D.C. And change the U.S. policy radically to promote cooperation in this part of the world and to reduce tensions, tamp down the military stuff, stop the gunboat diplomacy, stop all these provocations, and just help the people in this region develop their resources by basically working with China, working with Japan, Russia, all the countries in the region to try to encourage a peaceful development. But it requires a change of regime in Washington.
Hopefully that will happen in Washington. Thank you very much, Clifford.
Thank you.
And you're watching Dialogue. Thanks for joining us. I'm Joe in Beijing. Goodbye for now.